Lady Thelma Furness enters our story at the pinnacle of 1930s high society. Born into the privileged world of the Morgan twins, two American beauties who captivated both sides of the Atlantic. Through her marriage to Marmaduke Furness, Viscount Furness, she gained not only a British title but access to unimaginable wealth and the most exclusive circles in England. This chapter establishes the opulent backdrop of her existence: sprawling country estates, glittering dinner parties, and the constant performance required of women in her position. Yet beneath the surface of champagne receptions and royal invitations lies a profound emptiness, the realization that beauty and wealth, while opening every door, cannot fill the void left by a loveless marriage and a life lived entirely for appearances. The chapter introduces the central paradox of Thelma's existence. She possesses everything society deems valuable, yet finds herself perpetually waiting for a life that feels authentically her own to begin. The stage is set for her fateful encounter with the Prince of Wales, a meeting that promises to transform her from a wealthy ornament into a woman of historical significance, though at a cost she cannot yet imagine. 10 June 1936, Wednesday, Mayfair, London. The silver light of a London morning slid across Lady Thelma Furness's parquet floor, pooling at the feet of the Louis V chairs like water. Outside, on this June morning, carriages and motor cars drifted past in a steady hum, but the drawing room on Upper Grosvenor Street was still, almost ceremonial in its quiet. She stood by the window, her reflection faint in the glass, dark, curled hair perfectly set, pearls lying against her throat like a habit she could not remove. She looked like a woman who had everything. In reality, she was thinking about how it had all begun, and without quite admitting it, how it might all yet come to ruin. Thelma Morgan had entered the world on 23 August 1904, Sunday, as one of a pair. She and her twin, Gloria, were born into a fortune built on shipping and speculation. A New York dynasty that purchased respectability with the same ease it purchased real estate. Their childhood moved between Fifth Avenue townhouses and European hotels, a life of trunks and steamer tickets and nurses who came and went with the seasons. Wealth in the Morgan household was a given, like oxygen. Affection was less certain. Their father, Harry Hayes Morgan, had the distracted charm of a man always on his way to another engagement. Their mother, Laura, wrapped her daughters in French lace and social ambition, instilling early the belief that beauty was currency and men were the markets on which it would be traded. From the first, Thelma understood two things: their money impressed people, and yet somehow it never seemed quite enough. New York society in the 1910s, on winter evenings lit by crystal chandeliers and gaslight, still measured worth in names older than theirs. The Morgans had the funds to buy paintings, not pedigrees. Thelma watched her mother strain for invitations she could almost, but not quite, command. Perhaps that was why London so fascinated them. On 12 May 1921, Thursday, when the family first arrived at Southampton and then on to their Grand London Hotel, Thelma felt a thrill that had nothing to do with the damp English air. Here, titles floated about like confetti. Countesses and dukes moved through drawing rooms with an unconscious authority that made her mother's New York rivals look provincial. If America had taught Thelma to admire money, Europe taught her to worship lineage. Barely out of her teens, she married an older nobleman, James Vale Converse, on 22 February 1922, Wednesday, in a ceremony that felt more like a transaction than a union. He had the right sort of respectability. She had youth and glittering American dollars. It looked like a perfect match. But beneath the flowers and veils lay a simple truth. He wanted a decorative wife, and she wanted a story with more color. Her second marriage, to Marmaduke Furness, 1st Viscount Furness, on 27 June 1926, Sunday, promised something different. He was one of the richest men in Britain, a shipping magnate whose fortune made even her family's wealth look modest. Their houses were not homes so much as catalogues of taste, a Mayfair townhouse, a country estate, rooms perfumed with roses brought in by footmen each morning. She was now Lady Furness. The title fit perfectly on invitations embossed in gold, yet the man beneath the title was cool, preoccupied, often away on business or hunting in Scotland. Their conversations, when they had them, were polite, well-bred, and edged with absent-mindedness. He provided horses, jewels, and a place in the glittering, intricate tapestry of British high society. Affection, like so many things in her life, was assumed but not examined too closely. Still, from the outside, nobody would have guessed her doubts. On 3 March 1931, Tuesday, at a dinner in Mayfair, she held the room as if it were a well-trained audience. The table gleamed with crystal and silver. Emeralds winked at her ears when she laughed. Men leaned in to hear her stories. Women watched her gowns, determined to remember the cut for their next trip to Paris. It was that night she first heard his name spoken not as a distant figure on a postage stamp, but as a man, David, the Prince of Wales. "You'd adore him," a duchess told her, waving a cigarette through a curl of blue smoke. "He's quite mad for Americans. And you, my dear, are exactly his type." The words settled into Thelma like a spark finding dry tinder. By the spring of 1931, she had become part of a new orbit, the inner circle around the Prince of Wales. On 8 June 1931, Monday, at a country house weekend at Melton Mowbray, she was finally introduced. The room smelled of cigars and wood polish. Hunting prints lined the walls. He rose when she entered, a slender man with restless eyes and a smile that suggested he was both amused and slightly bored by the world. "Lady Furness," he said, taking her hand, "they tell me you are the most dangerous woman in London." "And they," she replied, letting him see the faintest hint of a challenge in her smile, "are terrible liars, sir." Laughter rippled through the room. Yet in the moment his fingers brushed hers, she felt a small, almost imperceptible shift inside herself, the dangerous sense of something beginning. By this June morning in 1936, standing at her window in Mayfair, she could trace an unbroken line from that introduction to the nervous tension coiled in her throat now. Titles, yachts, coronets, Cartier bracelets, royal arms embroidered on silk cushions. Her life had been a study in acquisition. But as the city moved beneath her, Thelma was suddenly aware of the one question she had never once allowed herself to ask. If everything can be bought, then what, exactly, can be lost? And why did she sense, with a quiver of foreboding, that the answer would arrive soon, and violently? Chapter 2. This chapter chronicles the golden period of Thelma's relationship with the Prince of Wales, from their first intimate evening to the establishment of their domestic routine at Fort Belvedere, his beloved country retreat. We witness the transformation of a formal royal acquaintance into a passionate love affair that consumes both participants. Thelma becomes not merely the prince's mistress, but his emotional anchor, providing him with the one thing his position had never allowed, the experience of being loved for himself rather than his title. Yet even at the height of their happiness, cracks begin to appear. The strain of living a double life weighs heavily on Thelma, while her husband's increasing coldness and her sister Gloria's mounting scandals in America create pressure from all sides. The chapter explores the emotional complexity of loving a man who belongs to an empire, the constant fear of discovery, and the growing realization that their relationship exists in a bubble that cannot last forever. The crisis point arrives when Gloria's custody battle becomes a public spectacle, forcing Thelma to choose between family loyalty and romantic security, a choice that will ultimately seal her fate. 15 September 1931, Tuesday, Borough Court, Leicestershire. The lawns at Borough Court on this September afternoon were as flawlessly manicured as the guests who strolled across them. Sunlight lay across the grass in long golden bands. Footmen, in discreet livery, moved like shadows, replenishing glasses before they were empty, adjusting cushions before anyone noticed they had shifted. Lady Thelma Furness watched the scene from the terrace, a cigarette balanced between her fingers, the ember flaring each time the wind toyed with it. The Prince of Wales, David, was below, laughing with a small knot of guests, his terrier darting about his feet. When he glanced up at her, it was with a familiarity so unguarded that several people nearby followed his gaze, their eyes sharpening. She had become, unmistakably, his woman. The transformation had not been instantaneous but incremental, like snow layering over a landscape until a new shape was undeniable. Dinners in town led to weekends in the country, then to more intimate suppers, drives alone in the countryside, late-night telephone calls on 20 January 1932, Tuesday, and countless nights at Fort Belvedere, where he finally seemed to breathe freely, away from court protocol. He told her he loathed the stiffness of royal life, the speeches, the uniforms, the endless expectations inherited like a curse on the day of his birth, 23 June 1894, Saturday. With Thelma, he could be David. He could be impatient, tender, sulky, affectionate. She learned, quickly, how to manage his tempers, soothe his insecurities, and keep his interest alive. "You're the only one who doesn't bore me," he said to her one gray afternoon in February 1932, leaning back in an armchair at Fort Belvedere, socks half off, whiskey in his hand. "That," she replied lightly, "is because you haven't met everyone yet." But in the privacy of her mind, the compliment settled somewhere dangerously close to faith. At Borough Court, that faith seemed justified. The house, her house, had become one of the prince's favorite refuges. Hunters, diplomats, American socialites, and English aristocrats moved through its corridors, their conversations braided with gossip and ambition. Every visit added another layer to Thelma's reputation. She was not only beautiful, she was necessary. She understood what he needed before he could articulate it, yet there were cracks. Her husband, Lord Furness, now moved at the edges of his own home like a politely displaced guest. His business often called him away, but even when present, his presence was muted. On 1 May 1932, Friday, during a small dinner at Borough Court, Thelma saw him watching her and the prince with an expression she could not quite decipher, part resignation, part calculation, and something colder beneath. "We're modern people, Marmaduke," she had told him weeks earlier, in London, attempting to smooth the situation with the charm that worked everywhere else. "Everyone has. Arrangements." "Arrangements," he repeated, his voice as dry as the gin in his glass. "Yes, but not everyone invites their arrangement to live in the newspapers." He did not forbid her. He did not demand an end. He nearly stepped to the side, as if allowing a train to pass that he believed would eventually derail on its own. Her twin sister, Gloria, wrote breathless letters from New York about parties and lawsuits, and her little daughter, Gloria Vanderbilt, whose custody was soon to become a public battlefield. Even in 1932, the storm clouds were already forming around the Morgan Vanderbilt name. Thelma read those letters in her satin-draped bedroom at Borough Court and felt a chill. Respectability, she knew now, was not a right, but a precarious loan. One misstep, one scandal, and the invitations could vanish like smoke. Still, that day in September, everything appeared secure. She had even invited along a small American contingent, pleased to show them the life she had built. Lady Furness, chatelaine of an English country house, lover to the future king. Among them was a woman whose name barely registered in her thoughts, Mrs. Wallis Warfield Simpson. Wallis, with her sharp Baltimore vowels and exquisite sense of dress, amused Thelma. There was something dry and cutting about her humor, an American directness honed to a razor's edge by careful observation. As they stood in the drawing room before dinner, Wallis examined a portrait on the wall and said, "Your ancestors look as if they disapprove of being immortalized in oil." "They're Marmaduke's ancestors," Thelma replied. "My own rarely made it into anything as respectable as a frame." Wallis smiled. "Then they sound infinitely more interesting." It was a small exchange, trivial by the standards of the day. Thelma thought nothing of introducing her to the prince later in the evening. Why should she? She was secure. She was his confidante, his solace. She believed that passion, once secured, was a fixed asset, not a fluctuating investment. "Sir, may I present Mrs. Wallis Simpson?" She said that night as the guests gathered in the long, oak-paneled drawing room. The prince, holding a glass of sherry, turned with the slightly automatic charm of a man used to endless introductions. "Mrs. Simpson," he said, inclining his head. "Are you enjoying England, or does it all feel frightfully dull compared to America?" Wallis's reply was crisp. "I found, sir, that dullness rarely comes from the country, but from the company one keeps in it." He laughed, genuinely. Thelma smiled, pleased that her American friend had amused him, and drifted away to speak to other guests. She did not notice that, later in the evening, his conversation with Wallis continued longer than most. Life in that world was a constant choreography of introductions, partings, shifting alliances. Nothing about that night felt particularly different. On 5 January 1934, Friday, Thelma boarded the SS Manhattan at Southampton, bound for New York. She needed to see Gloria, to advise, to lend her now highly burnished respectability to a family name again circling scandal. Before she left, she visited the prince at Fort Belvedere. "I won't be gone long," she told him, as he sat tapping ash into the fireplace, looking absent, cross. "How long is long?" he demanded. 6 weeks, she said, ridiculously short. "You'll barely notice I've left. I've asked Wallis to keep an eye on you, make sure you don't sulk yourself into a decline." He gave a thin little smile. "You're all conspirators," he said. "But hurry back, Thelma. I dislike being abandoned." She kissed him lightly, confident in the durability of what lay between them. As the ship pulled away on that cold January day, the wind lifting the ends of her fur collar, she watched England recede without anxiety. Behind her, in drawing rooms she had only just vacated, a new friendship was germinating. Letters would cross the Atlantic, some delayed, some not written at all, and by the time she returned in March 1934, she would discover that the world she believed anchored by her presence had continued, disastrously, without her. Chapter 3. March 1934 marks the beginning of Thelma's catastrophic downfall. Returning from New York after supporting her sister through the scandalous Vanderbilt custody trial, she expects to resume her position as the Prince of Wales's beloved companion. Instead, she walks into a nightmare of displacement and betrayal. During her absence, Wallis Simpson has systematically inserted herself into every aspect of David's life, transforming from an amusing dinner guest into an indispensable presence. The chapter details the painful process of Thelma's realization that she has been completely replaced, not through dramatic confrontation, but through a series of small, devastating signals: the changed seating arrangements, the casual dismissals, the way David now looks through her rather than at her. The crisis deepens as Thelma understands that Wallis has not merely stolen her lover, but has absorbed her very identity, using intimate knowledge gained through friendship to perfect her conquest. The chapter explores the psychology of betrayal and the particular cruelty of being displaced by someone she had trusted. It culminates in Thelma's final, humiliating visit to Fort Belvedere, where she is forced to witness her own erasure from the life she had helped create. 28 March 1934, Wednesday, Fort Belvedere, Windsor Great Park. The car wound through Windsor Great Park beneath trees just beginning to hint at spring. Lady Thelma Furness watched the familiar landscape slide by, the pale sky, the orderly curves of the drive, the distant glint of the lake, as though she were seeing it for the first time and the last, all at once. Fort Belvedere appeared suddenly, a toy fortress on its hill, whimsical and self-contained. How many times had she arrived here buoyed by anticipation, a small tremor of excitement running through her at the thought of his impatient welcome, his boyish sulks over her lateness. This time, the anticipation was muddied by something else, unease she refused to name. He had been distant in his letters, short notes rather than long confessions, mentions of friends for dinner that were oddly nonspecific, mentions, twice, of Wallis. "You worry too much," she told herself, smoothing her gloves as the car drew to a halt. "You have always been his harbor. One clever American cannot capsize an entire vessel." A footman opened the door. The air smelled damp, green, faintly smoky. She stepped out, fur collar brushing her cheek, and climbed the familiar stone steps. Inside, the hall felt occupied. Not crowded, but as if someone had moved things half an inch from where she remembered them. A different arrangement of flowers, a vase she did not recognize. On a side table, an ashtray with burnt cigarette ends she knew instantly were not David's. He preferred pipes at home. She handed her coat to the footman. "His Royal Highness?" she asked. "In the drawing room, my lady," he replied, eyes carefully neutral. She paused at the threshold, a hand on the doorframe, listening. Voices drifted through, his, animated, slightly higher-pitched when amused, and a woman's, low and precise, responding with what sounded like a joke. His laugh followed, free, unrestrained. Wallis. Thelma entered. He was standing by the fireplace, a glass in his hand, his posture easy. Wallis sat in one of the armchairs, legs crossed, a cigarette poised delicately between her fingers. She wore a simple, impeccably cut day dress that made the other women Thelma knew suddenly seem overdressed. For an instant, the scene froze. Then the prince glanced up. "Thelma," he said, with a surprise that was real but not, she noted with an inward lurch. "Delighted. You're back." She moved forward, every gesture measured, the perfect blend of intimacy and deference she had honed over years. "I said I would be," she replied, allowing herself to touch his arm. His answering kiss brushed her cheek, quick, almost fraternal. Wallis stood, smiling. "Lady Furness," she said. "It's splendid to see you again. New York hasn't stolen you from us entirely, then." "Not yet," Thelma said, matching the lightness. "England would be intolerably dull without me, I'm sure." They exchanged the polite phrases required by their roles, but beneath the words moved something harder. Thelma saw it in the way Wallis met her gaze, direct, assessing, without the faint obsequiousness most women exhibited around her. She saw it, most of all, in the prince's eyes, which flicked between them, restless, guilty, then away. They took tea. They spoke of trivialities, ships and journeys, and the miserable January weather she had escaped in New York. The conversation flowed, but there was a new pattern to its current. Jokes seemed to branch naturally between the prince and Wallis, references to moments in Thelma's absence, parties, dinners, private remarks that had become shared shorthand. "I told him he simply couldn't wear that tie with that suit," Wallis said at one point, laughing. "He looked like a particularly earnest bank clerk. And did I not change?" he asked, mock-wounded. "Under protest," she answered. Thelma watched the ease between them, the intimacy shaped not by passion, perhaps, but by repetition, by countless small hours spent together when she had been on another continent. "You asked her to keep an eye on him," she reminded herself, swallowing dryness. "You handed her the thread." Later, when Wallis had gone upstairs to dress for dinner, Thelma remained with the prince. "You've been busy," she said, forcing lightness. "Well, one must," he replied, staring into the fire. "The days are intolerably long otherwise." There was a pause. She broke it. "And Wallis? She seems to have been making herself useful." He shrugged. "She's amusing. You know how dull people are, Thelma. She talks. She listens. She says what she thinks. I can't bear flattery. She never flatters me." "Perhaps," Thelma said quietly, "she simply flatters you differently." He turned then, sharp. For a heartbeat, the air between them was not the air between lovers, but something more rigid and less forgiving, the space between a sovereign in waiting and a subject who had forgotten her place. "You've been away," he said. "You don't understand." The words landed with surgical precision. Away. Not here. Not indispensable. That night, at dinner, the seating plan completed the message. Once, she had been automatically placed at his right hand. Now, it was Wallis who occupied that position, her slim hands moving gracefully as she carved out slices of conversation for each person around the table. Thelma found herself 2 places down, opposite a minor lord who spoke earnestly about fox hunting. She smiled, played the part, said all the correct things, but the placement was an indictment as clear as any legal writ. Back in London days later, the sense of displacement followed her. On 2 April 1934, Monday, a newspaper column mentioned the prince's recent appearance at a small dinner, accompanied by a chic American friend, Mrs. W. Simpson, with no mention of Lady Furness at all. A hostess who had once begged for her presence now sent a note asking, "Will you be in town this season?" instead of assuming it. At the same time, New York's scandal machine roared to life around her sister Gloria's custody trial. Headlines blared about immoral behavior and nightclub scandals. Suddenly, their wealth, once a shield, became Exhibit A in a public prosecution of excess. At a tea in Mayfair on 29 October 1934, Monday, an older dowager leaned in and said, "My dear, I do hope your sister's difficulties will not reflect too badly on you. His Royal Highness is, after all, expected to embody a certain sobriety. In other words, you are a risk." Thelma returned that evening to her bedroom, the same one in which she had once read letters from the prince addressed "My dear beloved Thelma" in his jagged, impatient script. Now there were fewer letters, and those she had were worn at the edges from too many rereadings. She sat before her dressing table, the lamps casting a flattering honeyed light across crystal bottles and silver-backed brushes. Her reflection was impeccable. The same wide eyes, the same smooth hair, the same jewels at her throat. Nothing visible had changed, and yet everything had. What, precisely, was her wealth worth now? What good were titles, emeralds, Belgravia addresses, if they all depended on proximity to a man whose gaze had shifted an inch to the right? On the table beside her lay a folded newspaper cutting, mentioning Wallis again, this time in connection with a weekend at Fort Belvedere she had not been invited to. Beside it, an unpaid bill for some extravagant purchase she could not recall making. The realization came not as a single blaze of insight, but as a slow, suffocating diffusion through her chest. Her security, financial, social, emotional, had never been a fortress. It was a house of cards, its foundation not stone, but the fickle, human attention of a prince. And attention, she now understood, was a currency more volatile than any stock market. She reached out, almost absently, and turned the photograph of the prince on her dressing table face down. The silence that followed felt like the beginning of an avalanche. Chapter 4. The unraveling of Lady Thelma Furness accelerates as the full scope of her displacement becomes clear. This chapter explores the psychological devastation of watching her entire world collapse while being powerless to stop it. Wallis Simpson has not merely replaced her in the prince's affections, she has systematically erased Thelma's influence and presence from every aspect of his life. The chapter details the cruel mechanics of social exile, how invitations dry up, friends become distant, and her very identity as the prince's woman is transferred to another. Thelma's attempts to regain her position fail spectacularly, each effort only highlighting how completely she has been supplanted. The twist comes through her discovery that her financial security was always more precarious than she understood, built on assumptions rather than guarantees. Her husband seeks divorce, her reputation is tainted by association with her sister's scandals, and she finds herself trapped between 2 continents with no safe harbor on either side. The chapter culminates in a final, devastating encounter where Thelma is forced to witness the depth of David's transformation under Wallis's influence, realizing that the man she loved may never have truly existed at all. 12 December 1936, Saturday, Upper Grosvenor Street, Mayfair, London. On this December morning, London lay under a low, pewter sky, the air taut with a strange, exhausted quiet. 3 days earlier, rumors had crashed through the city like a tidal wave. By 10 December Thursday, they had solidified into the unthinkable. And on 11 December 1936, Friday evening, the voice of King Edward VIII had trembled over the radio, announcing to millions that he could not carry on his duties without the help and support of the woman I love. In her Mayfair drawing room, Lady Thelma Furness sat very still, staring at the black shell of the wireless as if it might speak again and correct itself. Around her, the room remained untouched. Silk curtains, polished tables, flowers delivered that morning in their customary profusion. Only the ashtray betrayed any disturbance, crowded with cigarette stubs, each one extinguished with increasing violence. The city outside reacted along its social seams. In club windows on Pall Mall, men in tweed shook their heads over newspapers blaring King abdicates. In East End pubs, the talk was more practical, less moral, but no less intense. In drawing rooms like Thelma's, lowered voices discussed one subject only: Wallis. Wallis, the American divorce. Wallis, that woman. Wallis, for whom a man had stepped down from an empire. Once, people might have used Thelma's name in that role. She rose and crossed to the mirror above the fireplace. The face that looked back at her was composed, if a touch drawn. At 32, she was still beautiful, though London had become crueler in its arithmetic. Beauty increased in value when attached to novelty. In women over 30, it was treated like a currency whose expiration date was printed in invisible ink. On a side table lay the morning papers, photographs of Edward, no longer His Majesty, his profile simultaneously fragile and stubborn, photographs of Wallis, taken before she had fled to the south of France to wait out the storm. There were no photographs of Thelma. At best, she appeared in oblique references, an earlier American favorite, a previous intimate of His Majesty's, a lady of transatlantic fortune once thought indispensable. She was, in effect, a rehearsal the world had agreed to forget. Friends invited her for tea, but their curiosity betrayed them. On 5 December 1936, Saturday, at a house in Belgravia, a hostess had leaned too far forward over the tea tray and asked, "Tell me, Thelma, did you ever imagine he might go this far for you?" The question was couched as a joke, but the edge was sharp. Thelma had smiled thinly. "My dear, no one goes this far for any woman. They go this far for themselves." It had been an unusually honest answer. Now, in her own house, she could not escape the overlapping collapses, his and hers. His crown, her illusions. Her finances, once assumed to be bottomless, had begun to disclose their limits. Lord Furness's business interests were entangled in the aftershocks of the Great Depression. Letters arrived more frequently from solicitors than from friends. One, dated 2 November 1936, Monday, sat open on her desk, its language antiseptic and devastating. The trust arrangements made during her marriage were less generous than she had believed. Certain allowances she thought permanent were, in fact, discretionary and under review. Discretionary, a synonym in her world for at someone else's mercy. During the height of her relationship with the prince, between 1931 and early 1934, there had been gifts, a bracelet here, a brooch there, a rumored settlement whispered about in the corners of parties. But most of what she had taken for security was suggestion rather than signature, a fog of assurances rather than ink on paper. Now, with him no longer king, with protocols of the king's mistress dissolved into awkward silence, many of those understandings evaporated. A banker she had known socially since 1930 requested a discreet conversation on 18 December 1936, Friday. His words were smooth, sympathetic. Their message was not, "There is some tightening, Lady Furness. Certain accounts, attached as they are to your husband's companies, have been, shall we say, restructured." "You mean reduced," she replied, not bothering with his euphemism. "I mean," he said carefully, "that you will need to exercise prudence." Prudence. Another word she had rarely encountered except in sermons and satire. The social unraveling was subtler, but just as real. In January 1932, she had been the gravitational center of dinners, the woman everyone glanced toward to gauge the prince's mood. By December 1936, she found herself at the edges of gatherings, people's gazes sliding off hers as if afraid of the complicated history she represented. On 14 December 1936, Monday, at a small supper in Chelsea, a younger woman asked, with innocent cruelty, "Were you very shocked, Lady Furness, by the abdication? I suppose you must know Mrs. Simpson rather well." "I knew her before any of you did," Thelma replied. "I introduced them, after all." A silence fell, brief but heavy. Then someone changed the subject. Thelma felt the moment lodge in her chest like a shard, to be remembered only as the woman who had made that introduction, who had unwittingly handed her lover to another woman and, in doing so, helped precipitate a constitutional crisis, was a humiliation no amount of champagne could dull. Yet there was another, more intimate twist waiting. One evening, on 20 December 1936, Sunday, she sat with an old friend, a barrister who had once advised her privately during a minor legal matter. He had drunk more than usual, emboldened perhaps by the cataclysmic atmosphere of the time. "You know, Thelma," he said, swirling his brandy, "you were never as protected as you thought. When you were with him, certain men, courtiers, advisers, made sure your situation remained fluid." "Fluid?" she repeated. "Legally. Financially. Nothing too permanent in your name. They didn't want any entanglements. A queen can be provided for. Mistresses must be movable. Denied leverage in case of complications. Complications. Like abdications. Like, she realized with a twist of bitterness, loving the wrong man at the wrong time. In other words, she said slowly, "I was meant to be disposable." He looked uncomfortable. In their eyes. Not in his, perhaps. His eyes, she said, setting her glass down with care, couldn't protect a crown. They certainly can't protect me now. Alone that night, she walked through her house as though through a museum of extinct confidence. Each room represented a different version of herself, the hostess, the lover, the heiress, the wife. None seemed to fit quite right anymore. They hung on her like gowns from seasons past, still beautiful, but subtly wrong in the cut. The abdication had finalized something she had resisted admitting. David, no, Edward, no, now simply the Duke of Windsor, had proved that he could destroy a throne for a woman. The terrible irony was that the woman had not been her. Whatever people said about romantic sacrifice, she knew the darker underside. He had chosen his own obsession over duty, yes, but he had also chosen one narrative over another, and in that act of selection, she had been edited out. Wealth, titles, jewels, all the paraphernalia of her world had promised insulation from such erasure. Instead, they had become the stage on which it played out with maximum visibility. Thelma extinguished her final cigarette of the night and stood for a long time in the darkened drawing room, London's muted lights flickering at the window. Somewhere, far away, he was beginning his exile with Wallis, surrounded by suitcases and sycophants. Somewhere, newspapers were already crafting their version of events, their lists of key players and incidental figures. She had been both. Now she was something quieter, lonelier, harder to name, the cautionary tale no one quite dared to tell too plainly. Chapter 5. The final chapter finds Thelma in her twilight years, living quietly in New York with the perspective that only time and distance can provide. The opulence of her past has faded into comfortable but modest circumstances, yet she has found a different kind of peace, one built not on external validation but on hard-won self-knowledge. As she reflects on the abdication crisis from the vantage point of decades, she grapples with her role as an unwitting catalyst in one of the 20th century's greatest royal scandals. The chapter explores themes of memory, regret, and ultimately, acceptance. Thelma has learned to live with the paradox of her existence. She was instrumental in changing the course of history, yet remains largely forgotten by it. Her final reflections are not bitter, but philosophical, recognizing that her true downfall was not the loss of wealth or status, but her failure to understand that privilege without agency is merely an elaborate form of powerlessness. The story concludes with Thelma's death, peaceful and dignified, having finally found the authenticity that eluded her in her glittering youth. 3 March 1965, Wednesday, New York City, Fifth Avenue. On this March morning, Fifth Avenue glittered under a cold, hard winter sun. The shop windows of New York were dressed in their usual ambitions, diamonds on black velvet, mannequins in impossible gowns, the kind of shoes that hurt just to look at. Lady Thelma Furness, though fewer people used the lady now, and fewer still knew why they should, walked slowly past them, her gloved hands clasped around the handle of a modest handbag. At 60, her beauty had thinned, but not vanished. The bones were still fine, the eyes still alert, though they now held an observer's distance rather than a participant's hunger. New York moved around her with a speed that made her feel both at home and alien. She had been born into this city's pulse on 23 August 1904, Sunday. It had formed the first language of her desires. Yet, after decades in London and on estates where time passed in weekends and seasons rather than days, the sheer velocity of mid-1960s Manhattan seemed at once exhilarating and faintly absurd. She paused at a bookstore window. In the display, alongside political biographies and a glossy volume on European royalty, lay a book about the abdication crisis. On the cover, a familiar profile of Edward VIII, and opposite it, the unmistakable, sharp-boned face of Wallis. Thelma smiled, but not with joy. Inside, the shop was warm, scented with paper and dust. She found the book easily. It fell open naturally, as if it had been waiting. Her eyes skimmed the chapter headings, "The Bachelor Prince, That Woman, for the Woman I Love." There, buried in a few paragraphs, she found herself. Among his earlier attachments, the text read, was Lady Furness, an American-born Viscountess who provided companionship and diversion during the early 1930s. It was at her country house, Borough Court, that the prince was first introduced to Mrs. Wallis Simpson. Companionship and diversion. The words were tidy, bloodless. They contained nothing of the late-night confidences, the laughter, the sulks, the way his hands had shaken sometimes when he spoke of the crushing weight of expectation he had never asked for. She closed the book gently. Time had, indeed, altered the proportions. The love that had once felt like the axis of the world now appeared, in retrospect, as one intense episode in a life full of them. Glorious custody battles, which had seemed apocalyptic in 1934, had resolved into tragedy, yes, but also into the messy, ongoing business of living. Fortunes had shrunk, replenished, vanished. Palaces had changed hands. Empires had rebranded themselves as commonwealths. What remained constant was less glamorous, the necessity, every morning, of deciding who she was without the spotlights. Financially, she had not fallen into complete ruin. There had been settlements, cautious investments, occasional support from family. She had learned, sometimes painfully, to read the things she signed. In 1940, on a gray Tuesday, she had stood in yet another anonymous office and insisted on having every clause explained, line by line. The clerk had been surprised at her insistence. "We're not accustomed to such detail, my lady," he had said. "Nor I," she replied. That is why I am insisting." She lived now in a comfortable but unremarkable apartment, its walls lined not with ancestral portraits, but with photographs. Gloria laughing on a yacht in the 1920s, her own younger self in a cloche hat, a blurry snapshot of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor at some mid-1950s gathering, there. Faces older, their glamour dulled by repetition. Sometimes, in quieter moments, she allowed herself the question others had flung at her more cruelly. What if? What if she had never married Lord Furness? Never met the prince? Never invited Wallis to Borough Court on that deceptively ordinary September day? But life, she knew now, was not a path neatly altered by the removal of a single stone. The forces that had driven David toward rebellion, his hatred of duty, his craving for adoration, his fascination with women who stood slightly outside the rules, would have found an outlet with or without her. Perhaps the names would have changed. The pattern would not. What she regretted was not introducing him to Wallis. It was the degree to which she had once believed herself exempt from consequence, because she floated on a sea of privilege. On this March day, she met an old friend for tea at the St. Regis. His hair had gone entirely white. Her hands, when she set down her cup, bore the delicate roadmap of age. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. He did not specify what it was. The world of titles and telephones that never stopped ringing, the sense that a glance between you and a man could alter the course of a kingdom. "I miss being ignorant of the cost," she said, "not the thing itself." He chuckled softly. "You always did have a talent for aphorism." "Survival," she corrected. "One must make meaning out of loss, or go mad thinking it was all for nothing." She walked home in the fading afternoon light, past doormen and taxis, past girls in miniskirts and men talking about Vietnam and civil rights and rock and roll. Their concerns were as real as any abdication, their dramas as intense. History, she saw, did not repeat a single story. It generated infinite variations on the same themes: power, love, the bargaining of self for security. At home, in the quiet of her sitting room, she took out a small box from a drawer. Inside lay a few remaining jewels, less grand than those she had once worn, but still lovely, and a folded note in a handwriting she recognized instantly, though she had not seen it in years. "My dear Thelma," it began, in David's familiar, slanting script. "Thank you for," and the rest, faded with time, was half illegible. She did not need the words. She remembered their sentiment. Gratitude, affection, an assumption, on both sides, that their story still lay ahead of them. She refolded the note and returned it to the box. What, in the end, was her downfall? Was it the loss of his love, of her status, of her money? Or was it the slow, necessary shedding of a fantasy that money guarantees safety, that beauty guarantees devotion, that proximity to power guarantees agency? Wealth had given her access to extraordinary rooms, to the interiors of palaces and of people. It had not protected her from cruelty, or from the consequences of choices she made half in innocence, half in vanity. Yet it had also, paradoxically, allowed her to survive those consequences with a measure of dignity most women in her position would never have been afforded. As the city's lights began to bloom against the darkening sky, Thelma sat by her window and let the past arrange itself not as a scandal, but as a story. A scandalous life, yes, but also an ordinary one in its hungers and errors, simply played out on a larger, harsher stage. If there is a curse to wealth, she thought, not without wryness, it is that people mistake the setting for the soul. She had lost crowns she never wore, fortunes she never fully owned, men she had never truly possessed. What remained was quieter, and perhaps, in its smallness, more real, the stubborn core of a woman who had once been used as a symbol, and who now insisted on being remembered, if at all, as a person. Outside, Fifth Avenue moved on. Inside, Lady Thelma Furness closed her eyes, not in regret, but in a kind of tired, lucid peace, the knowledge that downfall, like wealth, is only one chapter in a much longer, more complicated life. On 29 January 1970, Thursday, she would die peacefully in her sleep, having lived long enough to see the world she had once known transformed beyond recognition. Her obituary would be brief, mentioning her marriages, her connection to the abdication crisis, her role as the woman who introduced Wallis to the king. But those who knew her best would remember something else: her grace in defeat, her refusal to become bitter, and her hard-won understanding that the truest wealth is not what you possess, but what you become when everything else is stripped away.